Good afternoon and welcome to another installment of the Steward Advisors webinar series. This is Tim Obendorf with Steward Advisors, and today we're going to be discussing college financing, specifically the FAFSA and CSS profile. To help present, I'm joined by Dale Branda, also of Steward Advisors. Over the next 20 to 25 minutes, Dale and I plan to delve into how the FAFSA and CSS impact college financial aid. While we'll bring our professional expertise to this topic, you should know that we also have a personal stake in this material. Both of us have kids that are either heading to college in the near future, in college now, or have recently graduated, so we've lived most of what we're about to present. At Steward Advisors, we work closely with clients to integrate financial planning and investment management, always keeping a focus on our clients' values. As we've worked with many clients, one of the more complicated areas of planning has been the whole arena of college planning and funding. Every family's situation and values are unique, and there are a myriad of choices to make along the way. Not only have we helped many clients navigate college planning issues, but we also bring our own personal experiences to this topic. As we go through the presentation, we'll try to keep the conversation practical by sharing what we've learned from navigating college funding with our own families. Earlier in the year, we hosted a webinar on strategies to help fund college. You can find that presentation on our website at stewardadvisors.com. From that presentation, we received a lot of questions specifically about FAFSA and CSS. And also because we're in the FAFSA and CSS season, today we're going to focus on those two applications. We'll look at how colleges use information from these applications to award financial aid and then offer some strategies on maximizing financial aid. We'll leave some time at the end to answer any questions you might have. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dale to get us started.
Thanks, Tim. So the whole topic of college financial aid can get really technical really fast. So in the next few minutes, we are going to dip into the weeds just a bit, but hopefully then we'll zoom back out and talk about some practical strategies for approaching the whole financial aid process. So to get started, I want to take a high-level look at the way college aid is determined. And hopefully this will give us a baseline for understanding how colleges use tools like FAFSA and the CSS profile and why. So first, it's helpful to start with the cost of attendance. That's the all-in cost of attending the school that includes books, fees, travel, and all room and board, everything. Believe it or not, the numbers on the slide are real. I pulled them from the website of a highly competitive private school. So obviously they're on the high end, but just keep in mind that the cost of attending most institutions is much higher than what their published tuition rates are. So in addition to cost of attendance, colleges calculate what's known as the expected family contribution. As the name suggests, this is the amount that the student and his or her family are expected to contribute. I have this shaded in red because it turns out to be an extremely important number. Now, I know all the parents listening are really curious to know how colleges figure out what they can afford to pay, but I'll ask you to be patient for just a minute and we'll come back to this shortly. So obviously, the college knows the cost of attendance, and once they calculate what the expected family contribution is, the difference between the two is financial need. That's the amount of help the student needs funding his or her education. And it's also what drives the financial aid calculation. Now, remember, I shaded the expected family contribution in red to point out that it's really the main variable in determining financial need. So after your student gets accepted into a college or university, he or she will receive a financial aid letter that lays out the package that's being offered. Unfortunately, there's no standard format for these letters, and beware, some of them are a lot clearer than others, but the financial aid letter is likely to detail both the cost of attendance and your expected family contribution. It should also show the financial aid being offered. Usually it's broken down into various components like we have shown here. So in the example on the screen, the student's being offered a couple of different loans and a work-study option as well as several scholarships. I should note that this is all hypothetical data, but in this case, the total financial package is $48,500. Now, something to keep in mind is that it's possible the financial aid package won't cover 100% of the student's financial need. So this is sometimes called gapping. And unfortunately, it's on the student or the family to cover the gap in addition to their expected family contribution. And another beware, some financial aid letters do a better job than others of highlighting that there even is a gap. So pay attention to what the cost is and what's being covered. Now, turning back to the items in the financial aid package, we can see they break down into two groups. First, some of the aid being offered is federal student aid. Direct loans, work-study funds, Pell Grants for low-income students, if there was one. They're all provided through the federal government, typically the Department of Education, and they're all based on financial need. And to determine financial need, the expected family contribution is calculated using the free application for federal student aid, or as we all love to call it, the FAFSA. So you should plan on submitting FAFSA information to all or most of the institutions your student applies to. Federal aid is one common denominator that basically all schools offer as part of their financial package. Because it's so common and because it's the one tool that you're almost guaranteed to encounter, we're going to pay specific attention to FAFSA in the discussion today. However, federal financial aid isn't always the full story. A lot of schools, especially private schools, offer various forms of institutional aid. And this usually takes the form of scholarships or grants. And it's also typically funded from the institution's endowment or from special giving. So in addition to the items that we've illustrated here on our fictional example, a lot of colleges offer special funding for the arts, for athletics, for special areas of study, or a host of other categories. And there's always room for, quote, professional judgment. So students who are highly desirable to the institution for one reason or another might be presented with a better package of institutional aid. Now, some institutional aid could be based on merit, in which case financial need isn't a factor at all, but often it is need-based. And here's where it gets a little complicated. Not all schools calculate financial need for their institutional aid the same way that they're required to calculate it for federal aid. In fact, it's possible, if not likely, that your expected family contribution for federal aid might be different from your expected family contribution for the college's institutional aid. So to help figure this all out and divvy up their own aid, a lot of private schools have adopted the College Scholarship Service, or CSS profile, as a tool for calculating expected family contribution. The CSS digs more deeply into a family's financial circumstances, and schools who use it think that it gives them a much bigger, more complete picture. So we're going to spend some time talking about the CSS profile too, but we want to stay true to our time commitment and not get too deep into the details, so we'll concentrate mostly on an overview of how it differs from FAFSA. With that as our intro, let's dive into the FAFSA. So each year, the FAFSA opens for use beginning on October 1, and it remains open through the end of June. Now that said, the general rule of thumb is that you should submit your FAFSA data as soon as possible, since certain financial aid resources are only available on a first-come, first-served basis. So be sure to check also with the individual school or schools that your student is considering to make sure you know what their due dates are for financial aid information. Now on this slide, I listed a couple of general facts that I thought were good to know. First, technically, your student fills out the FAFSA. So whenever it says you or your, it means them, not you, the parent. And speaking from experience, if you're helping your student with the form, it gets a little confusing just who's being asked for what. Also, plan about an hour to fill out the FAFSA questionnaire online. Unless you're like me and you like to read all the help screens along the way, then you could plan a little more. And when you're done, you'll receive what's called a student aid report that shows your expected family contribution for federal aid calculations, and it'll summarize most of the data that you've entered. And obviously you want to be as careful as you can while you're going through this, but no, there is a process for correcting any errors that you might make along the way. And finally, schools that your student designates to receive FAFSA data should have access to it within about a day after you submit it. So finally, it'll help to pull together all of your financial documentation before you start. And just think of this as prepping to do your taxes. So you'll need W-2s, bank and investment statements, and so on. You should also have your actual income tax return at hand too, because you'll need data from that. And this is a good time to mention that FAFSA actually requires data from what they call the prior tax year. So in other words, if you're submitting a FAFSA for the 2020-2021 school year, which is what you might be doing right now if your student's a high school senior, then you'll actually be pulling data from your 2018 tax return. The CSS profile is similar here. They also ask some questions about your current tax year as well. But both the FAFSA and the CSS profile are online forms, and there's a wizard that takes you through data collection one screen at a time. The FAFSA has 6 sections, and we're not going to go through them field by field, but I did list a few things that you might want to note. So first, in the demographics section, you're going to put in all the standard stuff you'd expect for your student: name, address, high school attended, etc. But if the student's a male, he'll need to attest that he's registered for the selective service. That was a little bit of a surprise to me. And if not, if he hasn't registered, there's a link that you can pop out, register, and return. Another question that might be a bit off-putting is the disclosure of any drug convictions. So hopefully that's not a factor for anyone listening, but a conviction is likely to make a student ineligible for most financial aid. The school section is where your student can list up to 10 colleges that will receive FAFSA data. And if your student just can't limit him or herself to 10, don't worry. You can add more schools later after you do your initial submission. And also, here's something to be careful of. The order in which schools are listed has no impact at all on federal aid, but some states also use FAFSA data for state aid, and they might have specific requirements. So, for example, in order to qualify for Illinois state aid, you have to list at least one eligible in-state school in your FAFSA. The Department of Ed website where you access FAFSA has a list state by state of special requirements, and we'll provide that link at the end of the presentation. The dependency section is pretty straightforward, but it does determine whether parent financial information is going to be required. And unfortunately, in most cases, the answer is yes. And since entering a whole bunch of information from your tax returns can get tedious, the FAFSA allows you to link out to the IRS website and import relevant tax information directly. If you can make out the screenshot, you'll see I copied the screen from FAFSA that has a link where you can go out and hit the IRS website.
So the goal of the FAFSA is to come up with an index number that puts all families on an equal scale for financial aid. At the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the expected family contribution. When you complete the FAFSA, you'll get a number called expected family contribution, or EFC for short. This isn't necessarily what you will pay for your student to attend school, but it's a number that the schools will use to determine your financial aid package. Let's take a look at how the EFC is calculated. The items that add to EFC are parent income, student income, grandparents' 529 withdrawals, and a percentage of certain parent and student assets. Things that detract are the size of the household and the number of students. And there are some items that are not considered in the expected family contribution: retirement assets, family business equity, and home equity. Although the majority of schools rely on FAFSA, there are a growing number of schools that also use the CSS profile, and you should know that some excluded items get included in the CSS. Neither of the schools that my kids went to participated in the CSS profile, but Dale has some recent experience with the CSS.
Yeah, so let's take a look at the CSS profile for a few minutes. So as we've been saying, this is a form that you might need to complete in addition to FAFSA. It's used by around 400 different schools and programs. Most of them are private, and unlike the FAFSA, it's offered by the College Board for a fee. So it's $25 to complete the CSS and send it to one school, and it's $16 for each additional school. Now, as we said, the FAFSA is used to determine federal financial aid, and the CSS profile was designed to help divvy out institutional aid that many colleges provide. So it contains a lot of the same questions as FAFSA, so there will be overlap. But it also digs a lot deeper into your child's financial resources, which include yours. It can also contain supplemental questions that are very specific to a particular college or university. Unfortunately, completing FAFSA and CSS profile is not an either or. If the CSS is required, it will probably be in addition to the FAFSA. Now on the slide, I've listed a few differences between the FAFSA and the CSS profile. Since FAFSA is for federal aid, what you put on the CSS profile will not have any impact on those particular funding mechanisms. the CSS profile digs further than the FAFSA. So for example, a non-custodial parent in a divorce situation might need to file their own FAFSA profile information. The CSS also asks detailed questions about your home, family business, or a farm if you have it. And it asks about 529s or other assets that are held for your child by other adults. So in addition to collecting detailed data on your financial position in the most recently completed tax year, so that's what we refer to as the prior year, the CSS profile asks for a 2-year forward-looking projection of your financial situation. On the positive side, the CSS asks some questions about significant expenses that your family might have, like elder care or a large medical expense. And finally, I thought this was helpful. The CSS provides a text field near the end where you can supply any additional information that you think might be relevant to a college financial aid officer.
So our goal today is not to make you experts on FAFSA and CSS, but to give you enough background so that you can explore some planning opportunities to minimize the EFC and maximize financial aid. To some extent, this depends on your particular situation. Whether your child's college or university collects just the FAFSA or includes other data such as the CSS profile may play a significant role in which planning opportunities you can take advantage of. In general, need calculations tend to look more at income than assets. And so, for instance, since distributions from retirement plans and tuition paid by grandparents are counted as income, you'll be better off using those sources to pay tuition in your child's senior year, as there won't be another financial aid calculation that includes those income sources. Also, pay attention to the makeup of your assets. Don't accumulate unnecessary cash and investments outside of retirement accounts. If you do need to finance some of the college expense by mortgaging your home, use a home equity line of credit instead of a cash out refinance of your home, as the cash will be counted in the FAFSA, but it wouldn't if it was still in the home equity. Likewise, you may also want to consider paying down consumer debt. And if you regularly make charitable contributions, consider bunching them up to deplete cash or assets that might be considered in your aid calculation. Finally, a couple miscellaneous tips. As we showed earlier, there's a lot of overlap between FAFSA and CSS, so make sure the information you provide on both forms is consistent. Also, just like paying down debt, it may make sense to accelerate necessary expenses such as buying a new car to reduce your countable assets. Finally, be aware that ownership of assets impacts financial aid. For the FAFSA, non-family members' assets don't count. Parent assets count at a rate up to 5.64%, and student assets count at 20%. So there may be a planning opportunity in retitling some assets. With that, we'd like to open up for some questions, and you can use the Q&A button to send any questions you may have. Also, you can use the Q&A button to request a complimentary consultation regarding your college funding plans. While we're waiting for questions, I just want to point out we have some resources here that you can access. You can check out these websites for more detailed information about what we've talked about today. We'll also be recording this webinar, and so after the webinar is over, we'll be sending out a link so you can review the webinar or pass it on to friends and family that you might think might benefit from this. For the first question we have coming in is, should I wait to do my tax return before I submit my FAFSA? Dale, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess the short answer is no, you shouldn't wait. As we said, the FAFSA and to a large extent the CSS profile are based on prior year. So they're based on a tax return that you've already filed. So there's no need to wait. And in fact, as I said, there's a general rule that it's good to file the information as soon as you possibly can, because depending on the aid, there are some aid sources that are first come, first serve. So I guess the answer is no, you definitely don't need to wait to file your current year tax return, and you should get it in as soon as it's reasonable for you.
Great. And then second question we have is, are there scholarships or extra aid from college that will reduce my expected family contribution?
That's a good question. So unfortunately, in general, the answer is no. The expected family contribution is really designed to be the piece that the family comes up with. And when the university calculates scholarship aid that's available, or loans or various aid, they will always calculate it on what remains after the expected family contribution. So if for some reason the college decided to grant your student just a little more merit aid, probably what would happen is they would then not offer your student quite as much financial need-based aid. But it's very unlikely that they would come back and say, this reduces your expected family contribution. So unfortunately, that's not a number that in general will be that variable. I will say if there's been an error in calculation made on either your part or the university's part, that's a very different thing. And you would need to contact them and go through it, but I suspect that could be worked out. But just as a matter, that's really what they expect the family to come up with.
Well, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. If you have further questions, you can contact Dale or myself at Stewart Advisors. And like I said, we'll be sending out a link to this presentation in the next few days. And if you have friends or family that would appreciate this information, please pass it on. So at this point, we want to thank you and ask you to look forward to the next webinar in our series on financial topics. So thanks again. Bye-bye.